I rescued what I thought was a strange animal child from a flooded river. The next morning, something that called itself his father came looking for me. Everything I thought I knew about nature was wrong. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 37 years old when this happened. I worked as a wildlife documentary researcher, specializing in river ecosystems and predator movement patterns. In the spring of 2019, I was assigned to a biodiversity impact survey along the Upper Rogue River in southern Oregon, inside a restricted forest corridor closed to the public after seasonal flooding destroyed several trails. This is not folklore. It is not a campfire story. It is not a rumor I heard from locals. It is a documented field experience recorded in time-stamped logs and environmental data. I went into that valley with permits, satellite equipment, and a clear scientific objective: measure how predator behavior shifted after a historic thaw displaced thousands of animals. At that point in my life, I believed nature could be understood completely through patterns. If something behaved strangely, it meant I was missing a variable. It did not mean the world itself contained hidden intelligence I could not classify. That assumption lasted 3 weeks. My routine was simple and mechanical. I replaced camera trap batteries, calibrated hydrophones, and walked the riverbank every evening to check debris flow after rain. The area was quiet but not empty. Deer passed my sensors nightly. Coyotes skirted the treeline. Birds nested near the water. Everything followed predictable ecological rules. Then those rules bent. Animals stopped appearing on my cameras. Not all at once. First, the deer avoided the southern bend of the river. Then raccoons vanished. Then birds stopped landing near the water. There was no sign of fire, no chemical spill, no human intrusion. It was not migration. It was avoidance. I didn't understand then why that mattered. On the evening of May 14th, heavy rain loosened one of my water temperature sensors and pulled it downstream. I followed it along the bank, stepping between slick stones and fallen branches. That was when I heard a sound that did not match any entry in my field training. It was not a cry. It was not a howl. It sounded like breath being forced through a throat that had never learned to shape language. I assumed an injured animal, possibly a young wolf or coyote caught in debris. I moved toward the sound with professional caution, expecting panic or aggression. What I found clinging to a half-submerged log was small, roughly the size of a large dog, dark-furred. Its limbs were too long for its body, its chest too narrow, its posture too upright. It was struggling against the current, but not thrashing. It looked exhausted rather than afraid. I still refused interpretation. I told myself it was a malformed pup, a rare developmental anomaly. I used my jacket to reach for it, expecting teeth. Instead, it went still, not limp, still. Its eyes met mine. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. There was recognition in that gaze. Not animal panic, not instinctive fear. Recognition, as if it understood I was deciding something. I pulled it from the water and placed it on the riverbank. It did not flee. It sat upright, coughing water from lungs shaped wrong for any known species. I labeled it in my notes as an unknown canine juvenile. But anomalies do not observe you. As I stood there, soaked and breathing hard, I became aware of the forest behind me. The soundscape had collapsed. No insects, no birds. Even the river felt muted, as if something had pressed pause on the environment itself. That was the moment my training failed me. I felt watched, not hunted, not threatened, observed. Later that night, I wrote a single sentence in my field journal that I could not explain with data. Something altered the environment without touching it. I did not yet know that by rescuing what I believed was an animal, I had stepped into a situation involving intelligence, memory, and consequence. I only knew one thing with professional certainty. Something had seen me make a choice. Before that night, my world was structured by permits, procedures, and predictable outcomes. The project itself was funded through a regional environmental monitoring grant. Its purpose was straightforward: document how seasonal flooding altered predator and prey movement, along the upper Rogue River Basin. This area had been temporarily closed to the public after heavy erosion damaged trails and bridges, which made it ideal for an undisturbed study. I had full authorization from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, access to satellite weather feeds, and clearance to operate remote recording equipment for 6 weeks. Nothing about my assignment involved mystery. It involved numbers. My equipment was standard for long-term wildlife observation. 12 motion-triggered camera traps, spaced at regular intervals. 2 infrared night vision units, positioned near natural crossings. 3 hydrophones anchored in deeper sections of the river to track salmon movement. A portable weather station mounted near my trailer. Everything synchronized to a single time code, so anomalies could be traced back to environmental causes. I trusted this setup because I had used variations of it in Alaska, Montana, and northern Canada. I spent more nights alone in forests than in hotels. Isolation did not feel dangerous to me. It felt efficient. My daily routine rarely changed. I woke before sunrise, logged temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure, downloaded footage from the night before, replaced batteries, walked a 5-mile loop along the riverbank, checking sensor placements and looking for new tracks. In the afternoon, I cataloged movement patterns and compared them against historical data. At dusk, I returned to the trailer, cooked simple meals, and reviewed recordings until sleep. There was comfort in repetition. The forest behaved like a system. Coyotes traveled along the same ridge lines. Deer crossed a river at the same shallow bend. Even bears followed predictable seasonal routes. Every animal left behind readable information: tracks, scat, broken branches. Nothing was invisible if you knew how to look. That confidence mattered. It kept fear from entering my thinking. When storms rolled in, I understood why the river swelled. When birds disappeared from one section, I checked wind direction and temperature shifts. Everything had a cause. I had no reason to believe otherwise. The area itself felt safe in a way few places do. No human traffic, no distant engines, no artificial light. At night, the forest returned to something close to its original soundscape. Frogs near the river, whined through fir trees, occasional howls far off in the hills. It was not threatening. It was organized. I remember thinking that this assignment would be uneventful, useful for data, forgettable for memory. What I didn't realize was that I was being allowed to work there. That detail only became clear later. In the first 2 weeks, nothing unusual appeared in my recordings. The infrared cameras captured deer at dusk and raccoons near midnight. The hydrophones tracked salmon migration almost exactly as predicted. Even predator movement aligned with previous years. Then small inconsistencies began to appear. One camera near the southern bend stopped triggering despite fresh tracks in the mud. Another recorded empty frames at regular intervals, as if something large passed without heat. I assumed equipment malfunction, moisture, interference from branches. I recalibrated everything. That was my instinct. Adjust tools, not assumptions. What unsettled me slightly was not what I saw, but what I didn't hear. Certain nights were quieter than others. Not storm quiet, not winter quiet. A selective quiet. Insects faded first, then frogs. Then even the river seemed to lose its constant background rush. Silence in nature is rarely total. There's always something filling the space, except on those nights. I told myself predators were nearby. Animals go still when danger approaches. That explanation satisfied me because it fit the model. Something large had entered the area, probably a bear or a mountain lion displaced by flooding. I increased my perimeter checks, walked farther, looked for signs of territory marking or carcasses. I found nothing. No blood, no fur, no broken trees, no scat that matched known predators. Still, I felt no fear. I felt curiosity. That was the difference between who I was then and who I became later. I believe my knowledge protected me. That experience created distance between me and surprise. I believed I could always identify what I was observing given enough time. On the afternoon before I found the small figure in the river, I noted something strange in my journal. A single sentence that seemed unimportant at the time. The forest paused before sunset. There was no wind, no birds, no movement on the cameras. Even the water insects vanished from the surface. I stood outside my trailer, listening for something that never came. That was the first break in the pattern. Not a sound, an absence. The first time I saw it clearly was through equipment, not my own eyes. That mattered to me because machines don't hallucinate. It was the night after the silence I recorded in my journal. I had positioned 2 infrared cameras near the shallow crossing where deer normally entered the river. One faced upstream. The other covered the opposite bank. Both were set to trigger on heat and movement, synchronized to the same internal clock. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, there was a gap, not missing data, a gap in behavior. At 2:17 a.m., the upstream camera recorded normal river movement, water flowing, small animals passing, insects near the lens. At 2:18, something entered the frame that did not register as any known animal shape in my reference database. It did not run. It did not crawl. It moved with a measured pace, stepping between rocks as if it understood footing. The infrared silhouette showed a vertical mass, rising higher than a deer, but thinner than a bear. Its temperature profile was consistent with a mammal, but the heat distribution was unusual. The upper portion was warmer than the lower, as if its core was elevated. I paused the frame and enlarged it. The shape was wrong. The head was not forward like a wolf's. It was held upright. The shoulders were narrow but articulated like arms rather than forelegs. The legs extended downward in 2 distinct lines rather than 4. My first assumption was a person. That failed immediately. There were no trails open in that area. No footpaths. No human heat signature had appeared on my cameras for weeks. And the proportions did not match any adult human I knew. The limbs were too long. The torso too short. The movement too smooth for someone navigating rocks barefoot in darkness. I ran the footage forward again. It crossed the shallow part of the river without slipping. Then it stopped. It did something I did not expect. It turned its head toward the camera. Not accidentally. Deliberately. The infrared glow showed 2 bright points where eyes would be. They did not reflect like a deer's. They absorbed light and held it. The figure remained still for 3 full seconds. Then it moved out of frame. I switched to the second camera angle. From that side, the outline was clearer. It stood nearly 7 feet tall when fully upright. Its back curved slightly forward. The arms hung lower than the waist. The head was elongated, but not snout like a wolf. The jawline suggested teeth, but not in an animal configuration. I still refused to name it. I labeled the file as unknown bipedal mammal. That was the most neutral description I could write. My training demanded explanation. I ran through possibilities. Escaped animal. Severe deformity. Rare bear posture. Malfunctioning sensor overlay. Light distortion through rain. None of them fit all variables. The motion was balanced, controlled, purposeful. Later that same night, I saw it with my own eyes. I had stepped outside my trailer to check the weather station because the wind readings had frozen at 0. The forest was still again, not quiet from rain or snow, quiet as if sound itself had been removed. That was when I saw a movement near the tree line. At first, I thought it was shadows shifting with clouds. Then the shadow separated from the trees. It stood at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by ferns. I could only see its outline against the faint moonlight. The height was unmistakable. Taller than me, slim but solid. It did not crouch. It did not stalk. It stood. I focused on structure, not fear. 2 legs, upright posture, arms held close to its sides. The head angled slightly downward, as if aligning its vision with mine. I waited for it to behave like an animal. It did not. There was no growling, no retreat, no charging, no sniffing, no territorial display. It simply remained where it was. I tried to convince myself it was curious wildlife reacting to light from my trailer. But curiosity in animals has a different quality. It is twitchy, reactive. This was controlled. The longer I watched, the more I noticed something that unsettled me deeply. Its position relative to me never changed. When I shifted my weight, it adjusted. When I took one step back, it took one step forward, always keeping the same distance, always maintaining line of sight. That was the moment my rationalizations began to fail. Predators don't mirror movement. Prey doesn't hold ground. Humans don't appear silently in closed wilderness. This was none of those. I realized then that it wasn't passing through. It was staying, not hunting, not fleeing, watching. That was the word that finally entered my thinking. Watching. It stood there until the clouds covered the moon and I could no longer see it. When light returned, the space was empty. No tracks, no broken plants, no scent I could identify, only absence. I went back inside my trailer and reviewed the footage again, frame by frame. I saw the same posture, the same head turn, the same stillness. That was the moment my certainty fractured into something more dangerous than fear. This was not an unknown animal moving through my study area. This was something bipedal, and it was aware of me. The next contact did not happen at night. That surprised me. I expected whatever I had seen to remain hidden in darkness, to retreat to whatever cover it used when light returned. Instead, it approached in the middle of the afternoon, when visibility was absolute and my sense of control was strongest. I was cataloging tracks near the southern bend of the river, kneeling in damp soil with a measurement tool pressed into a fresh deer print. The forest had returned to partial sound. Birds called sporadically. Wind moved through the canopy in slow pulses. Then the wind stopped. I felt the change before I heard anything. A pressure in the air, similar to the moment before a storm breaks. I stood and turned toward the tree line, without knowing why. It was already there, not emerging, not stepping out. Present, it stood between two trunks about 30 yards away, fully visible. In daylight, the structure I had only seen as shadow became clear. The body was covered in dark, coarse hair. The shoulders were narrow. The chest rose and fell with slow, steady breathing. The face was elongated but expressive in a way I could not categorize as animal. It did not bare its teeth. It did not crouch. Its posture resembled something waiting to be acknowledged. My first instinct was not fear. It was documentation. I reached slowly for the camera strapped across my chest. Before I could lift it, something happened that stopped my movement entirely. Sound came from it. Not a growl, not a howl, a formed sound. Air shaped deliberately. The voice did not come quickly. It came with effort, as if the muscles involved were rarely used for that purpose. The tone was low, measured, and unfamiliar, but the structure of the sound followed rules I recognized. Language. It said my name. Not loudly, not softly, simply stated. I froze with my hand still on the camera. I did not answer. I could not. The voice continued, unhurried. It identified me by function rather than identity. It described what I had been doing, that I had been walking the river daily, that I placed small watching devices in trees, that I returned to the same shelter each night, that I wrote on thin sheets and spoke into machines. There was no accusation in the observation, no emotion I could detect, only accuracy. My breathing slowed to match its cadence. My mind searched for explanations that would preserve my model reality. Hidden speaker, hallucination, stress response. But hallucinations do not describe your equipment. It took a step closer. The movement was careful, as if it understood distance mattered. The voice continued. It explained that the smaller one I had removed from the river belonged to it. That water had taken its strength. that my interference had changed something that could not be reversed. The words were imperfect, but the meaning was not. It was not angry. It was precise. It spoke of territory without using that word, of observation without hostility, of balance without ideology. It communicated as if this encounter had been anticipated, prepared for. I noticed then that my fear was secondary to something else. Comprehension. I understood what it was saying. It understood that I understood. That mutual awareness created a silence heavier than any sound. The forest did not react. Birds did not scatter. Wind did not rise. It was as if the environment itself had agreed to hold still while the exchange occurred. The creature tilted its head slightly and described my devices again, this time with more detail. It referenced the red glow of my cameras at night, the clicking sound they made, the way they watched without being seen. I realized it was describing surveillance. It was aware of being recorded, not in a primitive sense, in a conceptual one. I tried to speak. My throat produced only air. The voice continued, explaining that the forest had adjusted its movement because of me, that animals avoided the paths I marked, that the quiet I noticed was not natural, but chosen. Chosen. The word stayed with me. I began to understand that this encounter was not random. It was a response. My presence had triggered it. The creature did not threaten me. It did not warn me away. It simply stated facts. That I had removed one of its young. That I observed instead of participated. That I carried proof. Then it said something that dismantled the last wall between explanation and fear. It identified the time of night. I reviewed my recordings. It described the angle of the camera that captured it. It knew where I stood when I watched it stand. In that moment, my training collapsed into something smaller and more fragile than knowledge. I realized this was not an unknown animal making sound. This was an intelligence acknowledging another intelligence. And with that realization came the most disturbing certainty of my life. It knows what I am doing. The silence that followed its last statement was not empty. It was occupied. I became aware of movement beyond what my eyes could focus on. Not motion in front of me, but around me. The feeling was similar to standing in a room where people are present but unlit. I could not see them clearly, yet I could sense position and distance through subtle shifts in sound and pressure. The creature did not turn its head, but its attention widened. It spoke again, slower this time, as if explaining something that required careful framing. It indicated that it was not alone, that others were listening, that this meeting was permitted but monitored. I heard additional sounds then, not footsteps, not voices in the way humans speak, more like low vibrations shaped into meaning, carried through the trees rather than through air. They were not directed at me. They were directed at the one in front of me. It was being evaluated. I understood that hierarchy existed before the word was ever implied. The one speaking to me was not in charge. It was responsible. It referred to itself in a way that suggested function rather than name. A watcher of crossings, a keeper of the young, a boundary presence. Its language did not contain metaphor. Everything was practical. It explained that my kind had passed through their territories for generations without awareness. That tools had changed, but behavior had not. That we built paths and devices without seeing who already lived between them. Then it said something that destroyed the final structure of my worldview. It described me before I described myself. It knew my age range. It knew how long I had been in the valley. It knew the markings on my vehicle. It knew that I left the forest at intervals to send information upward through invisible channels. Satellites. It did not use that word, but described them as eyes that never sleep and voices that never stand still. It understood technology as observation, not magic, not threat, observation. It told me that its kind had learned to avoid detection by studying the behavior of machines, that when light appeared in trees, movement shifted. When sound traveled through wires, silence replaced presence, that the quiet I had recorded was intentional. I did not understand then why that mattered, until it said that the smaller one I had removed from the river had not yet learned the rules. It had not learned when to hide from red light. It had not learned how to move without leaving heat. It had not learned the difference between being seen by animals and being seen by systems. I realized then that I had not rescued a helpless creature. I had disrupted a learning process. The voice was not angry. It was factual. It spoke as if explaining an accident that could not be undone, only compensated for. More sounds came from the forest. I sensed at least two other presences, farther back. They did not approach. They did not retreat. They observed the exchange. The one in front of me continued. It spoke of rules without calling them rules, of lines that could not be crossed, of times when visibility was allowed and times when it was forbidden. It described long periods when humans passed nearby without knowing, and shorter periods when humans came too close and had to be redirected. Redirected did not mean attacked. It meant confused, lost. I thought of missing persons cases I had studied during other field projects. Hikers who wandered off trails. Campers who never returned. I had always assumed terrain and weather. The creature did not confirm this. It did not deny it either. It told me that knowledge created imbalance, that if one of my kind proved their existence with devices, others would come with stronger ones, that the forest would no longer be a place of quiet separation, that children would not survive learning in open ground. That was the first time it spoke of survival in emotional terms, not fear, continuity. It explained that there had been agreements long before my lifetime, that avoidance was mutual, that presence did not require conflict, that silence was a structure holding both worlds apart. I did not feel threatened. I felt implicated. The creature described my recordings not as proof, but as exposure. It understood what would happen if I showed them. It described curiosity multiplying. It described how patterns would be searched for, how its kind would be mapped, categorized, named. It did not want a name. Names made things smaller. I noticed then that it never identified itself as a monster or animal or separate species. It referred to itself only as a neighbor of the river and a guardian of the crossing. The voices in the trees grew quieter. It told me that this conversation was rare, that most of my kind did not hear language, only absence, that my removal of the young won forced response instead of retreat. The revelation did not come as a dramatic truth. It came as accumulation. Piece by piece, the forest transformed from wilderness into a layered society of observation and avoidance. I was not standing in untouched nature. I was standing inside a system that had learned to hide from me. That realization was heavier than fear. It meant that my work, my equipment, my data were not neutral. They were weapons of attention. The creature finished its explanation with something simple, that my presence had created a choice. Not for it, for me. And as the last vibration of sound faded into the trees, I understood that the world I believed in, one where discovery was always good and truth was always harmless, had quietly ended. I had not uncovered a mystery. I had uncovered a responsibility. The creature did not ask me what I wanted to do. It described what would happen if I did. That difference mattered. It spoke of attention the way ecologists speak of invasive species. Once introduced, it could not be recalled. It explained that if I released my recordings, others of my kind would come not with questions, but with tools designed to remove uncertainty. Thermal drones, ground sensors, search teams, scientists, soldiers, people who would not accept silence as an answer. It did not frame this as threat. It framed it as mathematics. More observers meant fewer places to hide. Fewer places to hide meant movement would change. Movement changing meant the young would be exposed. Exposure meant learning would stop. And when learning stopped, survival would follow. It did not say extinction. It did not need to. The word existed in the space between us without being spoken. Then it described what would happen to me. It spoke of how my kind rewards discovery, that names would be attached to my work, that I would be invited to speak, that my images would travel farther than I ever could, that my career would change shape, that I would be known. It understood fame as a pattern too, a sudden spike of attention followed by permanent identity. It did not judge that impulse. It simply recognized it. I felt my thoughts separate into two directions at once. In one direction, I saw my footage published, peer review, conferences, interviews, proof of a new intelligent species hidden within North American forests. It would rewrite biology, anthropology, environmental science. I would no longer be a field researcher logging tracks and water temperatures. I would become a reference point. I would be believed. In the other direction, I saw what it described: increased presence, equipment in the trees that did not belong to me, lights in places that had never known them, the silence replaced by engines and voices, curiosity turning into control. I realized then that proof was not neutral. Proof demanded response. The creature said something that fractured me more deeply than anything before it. It told me that I was already trusted, not because I was human, because I had acted without knowing. I had removed the young one from the river without recording it, without measuring it, without documenting its body. I had chosen intervention over evidence. That had been my first decision. This was the second. It explained that if I kept my silence, the young one would be returned to learning, that the crossing would remain guarded, that the forest would resume its patterns, that my work could continue as it had, with only absence where presence had been. If I did not, the rules would change. The creature did not threaten me with harm. It threatened me with consequence. That distinction made the choice heavier. There was no urgency in its voice, no command, no demand, only patience. It allowed silence to stretch between us, and in that silence, my entire profession felt suddenly fragile. I had been taught that observation was virtuous, that uncovering truth was inherently good, that hidden things needed light. But standing there, with something intelligent choosing restraint over dominance, those principles felt incomplete. What if truth could destroy what it revealed? What if exposure was not enlightenment but erasure? The creature spoke again, quieter. It said that others of my kind had come before with devices and questions, that sometimes those people were turned away by distance and confusion, that sometimes they did not return. It did not explain how. It did not need to. It told me that my situation was different because I had already seen. I had already recorded. The danger was no longer ignorance. It was intention. I thought about the small one I had pulled from the river, about its weight in my arms, about how it had not fought me, about how its eyes had not looked like fear, but expectation. I thought about the footage stored on my hard drives inside the trailer, about the frames where it turned its head toward the camera, about the infrared outline that would ignite 1,000 arguments. I thought about how easy it would be to walk inside, upload everything, and let the world decide. And I thought about how irreversible that would be. The creature said one final thing that settled the conflict into clarity. It said that my kind measured worth in visibility, that its kind measured survival in invisibility, that these values could not coexist in the same space. I understood then that this was not a question of belief. It was a question of allegiance to my career, or to what had trusted me by speaking. Silence returned. The forest did not move. The presence in the trees remained distant, waiting. I did not feel fear in that moment. I felt responsibility, the weight of knowing something that should not be carried forward. I turned slightly toward my trailer, where my equipment waited, where proof lived, where the future of my work was stored on small black drives no larger than my palm. And as I took that first step away from the creature, I understood that whatever I chose next would divide my life into before and after. I was no longer deciding what was true. I was deciding what would survive. That was when I prepared to choose. I did not run back to the trailer. I walked. That felt important. Running would have meant panic. Walking meant decision. Inside, everything looked the same as it had every night before. The table with my laptop. The stacked hard drives labeled by date. The external battery packs charging against the wall. My notebook open to the last entry about silence and pattern breaks. This was where proof lived, not in the forest, in plastic and metal. I removed the primary drive first, the one that held the infrared footage of the crossing, the frame where the shape stood upright and turned its head toward the camera. The second drive contained the audio log from the hydrophones, the timestamps that matched the quiet, the metadata that would make the story undeniable. My hands did not shake. That surprised me. I connected the drive to my laptop and opened the files one last time, not to relive them, but to confirm what they were. Evidence. Clear. Structured. Something that would survive scrutiny. I realized then that destruction was easier than doubt. I initiated a full overwrite, not a deletion. Randomized data written over every sector. A process designed to leave nothing recoverable. I watched the progress bar move with the same calm attention I used for weather charts. When it finished, I removed the second drive and repeated the process. The camera memory cards came next. One by one, I snapped them in half and dropped the pieces into the small stove I used for heat at night. The plastic curled. The metal contacts blackened. Smoke rose briefly and then vanished into the vent. I burned my handwritten notes last. Not all of them. Only the pages that described shape, posture, and movement. The words that would lead someone else to the same conclusion. When I stepped back outside, the forest felt different. Not quieter. Closer. The creature stood where it had been before. It had not moved. The presence in the trees felt reduced, as if distance had returned to its proper place. I did not announce what I had done. I did not need to. The creature looked at my hands, then at my trailer, then back at me. The change in its posture was subtle but unmistakable. Its shoulders lowered. The tension in its stance eased. Trust was not given. Permission was. It acknowledged the act without gratitude, without ceremony. It communicated that the balance had been restored, that the young one would be returned to learning, that my work could continue, but not in the same way. It made one condition clear. My devices would be tolerated only if they did not seek what chose not to be seen, that the crossings would remain hidden. That red light would be answered with absence, that if proof appeared again, the silence between our kinds would end. It did not explain how. It did not need to. This was not a threat. It was a boundary. The forest began to breathe again. Insects returned first, then birds. Then the river resumed its unbroken sound. The environment felt released from restraint, as if a decision had unlocked motion. The creature stepped backward, not turning away, but dissolving into trees the way fog dissolves into air. The other presences withdrew without sound. I was alone again, not in the way I had been before. That night, I slept without reviewing footage. There was nothing left to review. My project continued, but its center was now empty. The cameras recorded deer and raccoons, and wind and branches. They did not record the crossing. They never did again. Before dawn, I wrote one final sentence in my journal and did not burn it. Some truths are preserved only by being forgotten. I understood then that my career would survive, but my silence would have rules. And if I ever broke them, the forest would not remain patient. I finished the project on schedule. My final report contained nothing extraordinary. River temperatures, salmon movement, predator avoidance patterns attributed to seasonal disruption. The data passed review without challenge. No one questioned the gaps because gaps are common in wilderness studies. Absence can always be explained by weather, by migration, by chance. I returned to my normal life with credentialed success and a private failure that could not be discussed. From the outside, nothing about my career changed. I accepted new assignments. I traveled to other forests. I installed new cameras and sensors. I continued to document ecosystems with the same precision as before. I spoke at conferences about habitat preservation and the limits of intrusion, but internally, everything reorganized. I no longer pursued anomalies. When a camera recorded an empty frame where movement should have been, I did not recalibrate. I noted it and moved on. When an area fell silent without explanation, I logged the silence as data, not as error. I learned to recognize patterns of absence. There are places where sound fades without wind, places where animals avoid paths that should be safe, places where technology functions but captures nothing meaningful. I began to treat those places as boundaries rather than problems. My advocacy shifted quietly. I became known as someone who argued for restricted zones, for less observation, not more, for the value of leaving regions unmapped and unmeasured. I spoke about ecological intelligence in abstract terms, about how systems adapt to pressure by hiding rather than fighting. People thought I meant animals. I did not correct them. Silence became part of my methodology. I stopped writing about certain nights. I stopped sharing stories from specific locations. I learned how to redirect curiosity without lying. I could explain erosion and animal stress and human interference with enough scientific language to satisfy most questions. What I never did was share the reason behind it. Over time, I noticed others like me, not openly, not intentionally, only in the way they spoke about certain regions. A park ranger who warned me away from a ravine without giving cause. A biologist who closed a study early because her camera showed nothing but stillness for weeks. A surveyor who said a valley felt occupied, not dangerous. None of us named what we were avoiding, but we recognized the same absence. There were moments when I wondered if the creature watched me still, not physically, but through consequence. If the silence I maintained was part of a larger pattern of permission. I never returned to the rogue river crossing. I requested reassignment whenever projects drifted near it. I did not want to test a condition that had been given. Years passed. Technology advanced. Drones replaced ground cameras. Thermal imaging became sharper. Data collection grew more aggressive. And with each advancement, I felt a quiet tension return to places I knew should remain undisturbed. I began to advocate for limitations on those tools, not publicly as fear, privately as ethics. I wrote papers about the danger of overexposure, about how discovery without restraint could destabilize environments faster than climate. My arguments were accepted as philosophical, not experiential. That was safer. At night, when I camped in remote areas, I listened differently. I learned to distinguish between natural silence and intentional quiet. The difference is subtle. Natural silence still contains movement. Intentional quiet feels held. There were times I sensed presence without seeing form. Not close, not threatening, simply aware. I never attempted to record it. I never raised a camera. That was the rule I had accepted. My life did not become tragic. It became narrower, focused. I carried a truth that had no place in publication, a knowledge that could not be cited or shared. I learned that some forms of intelligence survive only because they are not studied, and that some witnesses are not meant to speak. The world continued to believe it was alone in its forests. I continue to help keep it that way. I have carried this silence longer than I carried any degree or credential. It is not heavy in the way fear is heavy. It is heavy in the way responsibility is heavy. A weight that does not press down but stays with you, shaping how you move through the world. There are days when I wonder what would have happened if I had chosen differently, if I had released the footage, if I had allowed curiosity to outrun caution. The answer is always the same. My life would have been louder, and something else would have become smaller. We believe that truth is harmless. That exposure is enlightenment. That discovery improves what it touches. Those ideas work when what is discovered cannot withdraw. Forests can be measured, rivers can be mapped, animals can be cataloged. But intelligence that survives by remaining unseen does not benefit from attention. It benefits from distance. The cost of my silence has been isolation. There is no place to put this knowledge, no journal that would print it, no colleague I could confide in without becoming the story myself. I learned to live with a version of the world that cannot be explained to others. That is what makes it frightening, not the creature, the limit of language. When people speak about wilderness now, they talk about resources, about recreation, about conservation. Rarely do they talk about restraint. Rarely do they consider that not everything hidden is waiting to be found. Sometimes, when I walk the protected land, I feel the same pause I felt years ago by the river, the subtle break in pattern, the moment when insects stop and wind holds its breath. I do not look for shapes anymore. I look for intention. There's a difference between emptiness and quiet. Emptiness means nothing is there. Quiet means something has chosen not to be seen. I think often about the young one I pulled from the river, about how close it came to learning the wrong lesson, about how easily that mistake could have multiplied into something irreversible. My single action did not save a species. It preserved a boundary. That is the truth I live with, not that something intelligent exists in the forest, but that it trusted a human once. Trust is fragile when it crosses worlds. I still believe in science. I still believe in evidence. But I now believe there are truths that destroy the conditions that allow them to exist. Some forms of life do not survive recognition. They survive discretion. If you ever find yourself in a place where sound falls away without reason, where your equipment records nothing but stillness, where you feel observed without threat, consider the possibility that you are not meant to look closer. Not everything hidden is lost. Some things are protected by being unnoticed. I do not expect you to believe this. Belief is not required. Only caution. The forest does not belong solely to what can be named. There are intelligences that have learned to live beside us by staying out of our stories. They do not need worship. They do not need fear. They only need us to continue walking past without insisting on proof. I have done that for many years now. And sometimes when the night becomes too quiet and the air feels held in place, I wonder if the one who spoke to me still stands at the crossings, watching the movement of humans the way I once watched animals. Not as a predator, not as prey, but as something that learned once that silence can be shared, and that knowledge can be dangerous.